Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back and thanks so much for your continued support. This is a continuation of my series of videos on how you can play spellcasters and how you can optimize them and build them in effective ways. The first video, linked above, is all about the very basics, how you can just look at spells without getting overwhelmed. And I highly recommend it if you are a new player looking for advice on how to start looking at spells. Today's video is going to cover the basics of spell selection, the basics of how and why you have to pick certain spells or make certain decisions, and hopefully make all of your lives easier in the future. Before talking about how you should select your spells, I wanted to talk a little bit about why it's so difficult in the first place, because if you're a new player to Pathfinder, or even if you're just new to spellcasters, you may feel a bit like you're being unduly punished, especially if you're used to other systems with similar magic systems that don't punish you as hard. The summary is that Vancian spellcasting is the root of all these problems. Vancian spellcasting is the name given to D&D and Pathfinder style spellcasting because it was originally inspired by Jack Vance's Dying Earth novels. Now, prepared spellcasting is much closer to the true Vancian spellcasting in that you prepare exactly 2 castings of Force Barrage and exactly 1 casting of Fireball, and then when you've used it, you've used it. It doesn't come back till later. For the rest of this video, I'm referring to both as Vancian spellcasting, but just know that prepared and spontaneous are different and prepared is much closer to the original. Vancian spellcasting does have some really great benefits. One of the biggest ones, in my opinion, is that with a very condensed amount of page space, you can express a very huge amount of character variety. Think of how much page space the kineticists and all of their unique bespoke feats can take. But then spellcasting, each spell that can be picked by any number of traditions represents that variety for 5 or 6 different spellcasters. This is a great way to give people who want more knobs to turn in their character all those knobs without needing that much page space. It's very clear why Vancian spellcasting is so tempting for Paizo and even WotC to keep going with. If Vancian casting was just all drawbacks, they would have moved past it. There is a real benefit to it. And I do want to set that aside before I start attacking Vancian spellcasting. There are some real costs to Vancian spellcasting. One of the biggest ones is that when every character can be looped through that insane amount of variety, you must balance the game with the assumption that they'll use a good amount of that variety. Wizards have to be balanced with the assumption that they have looked at all 700 of their spells and have reasonably picked the ones that they think will be useful. Now, that doesn't mean the wizard needs to be balanced with the assumption of perfect variety, but the wizard does have to account for the variety the spells can bring. You have to assume they can target multiple spells. You have to assume they can do multiple damage types. You have to assume that sometimes with a little bit of foreknowledge, they have even brought something that's nearly perfect for the situation they're in. If a game doesn't do that, you end up with something like 5th edition or 5.5 edition D&D, where because the game is balanced for a wizard who does nothing but throws out Fireball to still feel good about themselves, it means that any wizard who has even a moderately high degree of understanding of spells as a whole can practically break the game. And it's not just wizards. I'm using wizards, but all spellcasters in D&D to varying degrees can just break the game. Pathfinder chose to balance around that variety the spellcasters can bring, and that means if you don't use that variety, you might end up feeling a little bit punished. Similarly, as casters level up, games need to expect those casters to use their lower rank slots. They need to be able to account for that. When you don't account for that, again, in D&D, there's the prime example of the shield spell. When casters get past around levels 6, 7-ish, at that point, first level spells become so cheap in D&D 5th edition that you can practically spam them. Spells like Healing Word to bring somebody who's at 0 HP, or spells like Shield that you can efficiently weave into your turn because they're a bonus action and reaction respectively, become obscenely good. Again, it can imbalance the game because the game was not built to expect that from the players. The game was built to expect a fairly straightforwardly played spellcaster to also have a good time. And finally, there's the real cost of spell bloat. In the previous video, I showed you that there's around 1,000 slotted spells and cantrips in the game, ignoring focus spells because you get those from your class. That's just so many. All three of these factors make choosing spells hard. Let's see how you can pick spells that are good for your character. The first thing I wanted to go into is how you can select spells in a certain way to shape the role you take in combat within your party. The first role I wanted to look at is damage and debuffing. Now, to be clear, damage and debuffing are two distinct roles with distinct game feels. However, there's a lot of overlap in how you select spells for them. The first and most important factor, and this is true for every role, including the ones in the future slides, is picking the right tradition. Damage is the purview of arcane and primal spellcasters usually. Debuffing is for arcane and occult spellcasters. Now, I do need to include a very big caveat that occult and divine spellcasters often get class features to offset the fact that they're not the best at this role, that they're only decent. You may find that an occult blaster is really good, for example, a psychic, or even a divine blaster like a flames oracle. Make sure that when you're picking the tradition, you also look at your class features because they might cover for the weaknesses of your tradition. Arcane and primal casters generally don't tend to get these weakness coverages, but occult and divine casters do. Regardless, what I said is true in a broader sense. The first thing you want to do when picking offensively targeted spells is figure out how to target a variety of defenses. Usually, this takes the shape of armor class plus 2 out of 3 saving throws. So out of reflex, fortitude, and will, you have to pick 2 to target. This can vary depending on your exact tradition. Arcane spellcasters can target all 4. Occult spellcasters may eschew AC entirely, but try and target all 3 of the other saves. It can vary. The general gist is target a variety of defenses. Now, a lot of people misquote this advice, and they say you should try to hit the enemy's lowest defense, and I think that sometimes actually lowers your performance. Trying to always hit the lowest defense means you're spending actions on recall knowledge and sometimes even falling victim to false information. Simply avoiding the highest defense is the best practice, in my opinion. You will still often get good information on what the lowest defense is, and when you do, you'll feel really good about it. But generally speaking, just focus on the middle tier defenses, not the lowest. Just make sure to avoid the highest. When fighting a troll, it's not that important whether reflex, will, or AC is its lowest defense. What's really important is just don't hit their fortitude. Then you want to try to have at least 2 damage types and or traits on your spell. If you focus on fire damage, bring the backup option for fire immune enemies. If you have a lot of mental debuffs, carry a few debuffs that are not mental trait. This, combined with the previous point, will help make sure that you have enough diversity to always hit the enemy where they don't want you to hit them. And to be clear, sometimes you might still run into their best defense. Sometimes you're a prepared spellcaster and the enemy's best defense is all you have left in your slots. It happens. You'll feel bad about it, but by and large, those bare minimums I listed of targeting 3 out of 4 defenses and having at least 2 damage types or traits will carry you through the game, and make sure you have good performance while doing it. On top of that, make sure you think about the reliability of your options. Auto effect spells are really good to consider whenever they're available to you. Always carry Force Barrage because it's just such a good spell to have. If you don't know what defense to target, just use Force Barrage. It will give you a very middle of the ground performance. Remember, you will perform better if you knew what save to target, but if you're not confident or if all you have left is things that target their highest save, throw out a Force Barrage. Likewise, consider single target spells with success effects. So AoE spells, you generally don't need to look at the success effect that hard. When you hit a large number of targets, it's reasonable to expect that 1 or more of them will fail or even crit fail. But with single target spells, a boss will usually have somewhere in the 15 and a 35% chance of failing against your save or crit failing, and a 50% chance that they'll succeed. So if you can get a partial effect on success, that's really good. Likewise, make sure to avoid spells that are the incapacitation trait if they're a single target, because when you fire these at the boss, they will be crit succeeding like 70% of the time, and it'll feel terrible. Finally, and this is something I see people underrating all the time, you don't just want to be targeting a variety of defenses with the exact same effects. You also want a variety of effects. If you're a damage dealer, it's a good idea to have some damage spells that at least have a rider on top. Say if you're building a pyromancer, a lot of your fire spells are just going to do damage. But if you complement that with a spell like Ignite Fireworks that can dazzle enemies, or Ash Cloud that can perform some area denial, in terms of the defense you target, I'm bringing both slow and containment. One targets fortitude, one targets reflex. They both perform action denial. Variety of defenses within the same effect. But I also want to bring a variety of effects. In reflex, I have containment for action denial, but I also have acid grip for force movement, and I also have fireball for damage. Having both axes of variety like this will go a long way towards making you feel good about your spellcaster. And finally, whenever you're picking spells, make sure you're accounting for weird stuff. Whenever an enemy has a gimmick, it often comes down to the spellcaster to solve this problem. If the enemy has a wall of force, you are expected to have disintegrate. If the enemy has flight, you are expected to have earthbind or falling sky or fly or airwalk. If the enemy has invisibility, you're expected to bring revealing light to the table. See what you can do to address weird stuff within the gaps in your spell list. And if you can't address it, make sure you communicate it with the other spellcasters in your party, because maybe they'll have to address it. So that is all of the fundamentals for picking damage and debuffing spells. The next thing I want to look at is buffing, healing, and damage mitigation. It's first really important to look at how focused you plan to be on this. Before you even look at spells, you have to think about how important is this role to you. Is this a backup option for your offensively oriented spellcaster? For example, maybe you're a ice mage who then uses healing as a backup option anytime your enemies are immune to cold damage. Or maybe this is the primary goal for your caster. Maybe your caster is built around uplifting others. As a primary goal, you still can't do this 100% of the time. This is not true for damage and debuffing. You can damage and debuff 100% of the time and you'll feel good about it. But you cannot do that on a buffing, healing, or mitigation-oriented spellcaster, because there's going to be off turns. There are turns where everyone's been buffed and no one's really close to going to 0 HP. You have to have at least a little bit of offensive options from the previous slide to pad out those turns for you, even if this is your primary goal. As always, pick the right tradition. Buffing is where occult shines at its best. Divine and arcane are like 9 out of 10 good, but occult is 10 out of 10 good, because it takes the best of divine and the best of arcane. For healing, divine and primal are the best, and occult is really good. For mitigation, all 4 traditions are able to do it. And mitigation actually is a really good thing for a backup option for this reason. If you're an arcane spellcaster, you can't heal at all, and while you can buff, you may not carry quite the variety of buffs that your party may need you to be carrying. But mitigation is just something you can interleave in your turns to protect your party with. Throw in a Shattering Gem or a Hidebound or a Heightened Invisibility. Your friends will feel good, and you won't have to worry about the enemy's defenses if they line up really well against the offenses you brought to the table. So mitigation makes for a really good backup option, whereas buffing and healing make for really good primary options. Mitigation can also be used as part of a healer's primary toolkit, though. The most important thing is make sure you pick buffs and heals to suit your party and to suit the situations they're in. When do you consider defensive versus offensive buffs? Do you bring Benediction or do you bring Bless? Do you bring Heroism because of its saving throw benefits or because of its attack roll benefits? Are you using Greater Invisibility to protect a friend? Or are you using it to give a rogue easy access to off guard? These are all really important considerations, and they vary party to party and even combat to combat. So always consider, is this a really tough fight? Are we being swarmed? Are the squishies in danger? If so, perhaps defensive buffs are more important. But then also think of your party. Is there a monk or a champion who's really good at helping the party stave off the damage we're about to get? A champion would be really good against a single target, but a monk would be really good at mitigating damage against multiple targets. Think about all of these options, because the way they interact with each other defines whether you want to bring defensive or offensive buffs to the table. Likewise, consider if you want burst healing or damage mitigation. Are your frontliners the kind who, due to their action economy, find themselves taking big hits? Like, do you have a Magus in the front line? Then you probably want burst healing. But are your frontliners the kind who have a lot of action flexibility, who have their own shield? Maybe you just want damage mitigation. Maybe instead of healing your friend, all you need to do is throw in a protector tree or a hidebound to absorb 1 hit for it, and their shield or their buddy who's a champion absorbs the other hit for them. The general rule of thumb I apply is that the more self-sufficient your friend's defenses are, the more you should focus on offensive buffs and damage mitigation. The less self-sufficient those are, the more you should focus on defensive buffs and burst healing. It exists on a spectrum, and you would have to spend some time to get a feel for it for your party and the kinds of encounters the GM likes to throw at you. Next, we'll be looking at my favorite role, that of the battlefield controller. When I say battlefield controller, I mean someone who can reshape the battlefield in a meaningful fashion. You can move enemies around into disadvantaged positions, you can divide and conquer enemies, etc. Now, it can be quite hard to make this your sole focus. Firstly, at low levels, you just don't have that many good spells to pick, so you really do need to be doing the other things alongside your control. And then even at higher levels, when you've got your walls and your containments, you drop a control spell. You have now divided the battlefield. Now what? A battlefield controller's turn often looks like an early, first or second turn spell that helps you shape the way the battle will go, and then perhaps a bit of control thrown in along the way, perhaps some forced movement, but primarily you'll be focusing on helping your party close the combat faster now. As always, it's important to pick the right tradition. Arcane and Primal are the uncontested best at this. Occult and Divine sort of catch up in the higher ranks of spell slots, but Arcane and Primal still just are that much better than them. How do you use controlled spells though? And that is kind of the important question in what you do for selecting your spells. The most important thing is you have to coordinate it with your party. You should not pick spells that sort of lock your friends out of combat. You should only Wall of Stone an entire encounter away from you if, for example, your party has somebody who can use that extra time throwing out things that they didn't want to be spending their in-combat actions on. For example, you come across a dragon, you put them into a Wall of Stone, and while they're breaking out of that Wall of Stone, the other spellcaster in your party casts spells like Fly or Airwalk on your marshals. Likewise, maybe you'll put the enemy inside a Wall of Stone and then you'll cast Haste, and now it'll feel like you got a chance to pre-buff at the cost of an extra spell slot. You have to suit it to the specific encounter and to your party. If your party struggles with dealing with really large quantities of foes, you want to be looking at divide and conquer options like Wall of Stone. If instead it's okay at dealing with large number of foes, maybe you don't want to divide and conquer. Maybe you just look at options like Freezing Rain, Entangling Flora that help you delay the engagement, but then it feels like you're taking on the enemy piecemeal and your party is good enough at that. Maybe you don't need to just divide the whole battlefield at that point, right? Scouting is a necessary part of using control spells well. I recommend having a familiar, or if not a familiar, asking somebody with high perception and stealth in your party to help coordinate with you. Approaching a battle in a different way can massively multiply the value of your control. I have had combats where going in from the east rather than the south meant that we managed to approach what is a bottleneck for the enemy, and that made my Entangling Flora feel insanely good. The more information you can have about the combat that's coming up, the better your control spells are going to feel. Control also tends to be a really good way of adding unconditional reliability. Most control spells have at least some impact that is automatic. Hypnotize, which can be seen as a debuff or control spell, automatically dazzles enemies. Entangling Flora puts them in difficult terrain. Freezing Rain, same. Wall of Stone just blocks them off. Wall of Force just uncontestedly bars off a section of the encounter if you use it indoors, for example. A lot of control spells tend to be really reliable for a variety of reasons. So it's a great way to add unconditional reliability for an offensively built spellcaster who doesn't have that reliability all the time. Another thing to consider is that control options can combo really well with existing debuff and damage options. If you make it hard for enemies to move around, you make it easy for somebody to AoE them. If somebody uses a debuff on a group of enemies, you can use control to wall off the section of the enemies that did not fail against that debuff, for example. All of these are also considerations to make, and they go back into coordinated with your party because these debuff and damage options may not even come from you, they may come from somebody else. So when picking control spells, it is really important to think about the actions of your party, how your control will impact them, how they can benefit from your control, and how it works with the specific encounter. So that concludes the talk about how your role can impact your spell selection. Now, to be clear, the role is the first step of how you start narrowing your spell selection. If you come to me and say, I want to build a spellcaster, I have literally no idea what to tell you. But if you come to me and say, I want to build a debuff-focused spellcaster who still has very good buffs, Now I know to tell you to look at the occult spell list. And then from there, you can narrow down the list on your own because you just ignore damage spells. And maybe you look at 1 or 2 healing spells, but you don't look at like being a dedicated healing plus restoration specialist. That's why roll was the first step we take, because it narrows down the list from being 1,000 spells to perhaps 50 or so spells at rank 1, and then you start building out from there. But it's not the last step. The next important factor to look at is when do you want to heighten spells from lower ranks versus when do you just want to pick a new spell that is natively at the rank you're looking at. Now, there's no single right answer. This is more of an art than a science. Low rank spells are purposely filled with generically useful signature options. They're filled with all the things a caster should be considering their staple throughout their career. Conversely, higher rank spells tend to have more permission allotted to them. They're allowed to do more. You can clearly see this by looking at trees of spells. The most transparently obvious one is if you look at all the spells that inflict frightened, fear, agonizing despair, vision of death, unspeakable shadow. You can clearly see a through line where as you get to higher levels, you're just allowed to do more. Likewise, agitate versus slow. Would you really consider heightening agitate over just casting a slow and getting that hard action denial? Look at AoEs then. Between levels 1 and 5, your Breathe Fire has become Fireball. Fireball is so much better. It gets to cover so much better an area. By level 11, you have Chain Lightning, which is now incredibly ally-friendly and can hit way more targets without having to worry about placement, but it carries a risk. But then at level 13, you get Eclipse Burst. That can hit even more targets and doesn't carry a risk, but now it might hit your allies. You will see that at higher ranks, the spells that are natively in those ranks are just allowed to do weirder things, and that makes this conversation complicated. The exact answer varies depending on your exact role. Let's say you're a buff plus heal bot. This doesn't really enter the conversation for you, right? Like, you always have to heighten your heal or soothe into your maximum rank. Yes, you may unlock a couple of the funner healing spells that do other things. Maybe you'll unlock something like Drop Dead, or that reaction spell that prevents death, whose name I'm forgetting, that I'll edit in later. Or you might unlock buff options that heighten better. For example, once you get to level 5, your heroism is largely going to replace your bless. But then once you get to level 11, you're going to continue heightening heroism. So I think with buffs and heals, the answer just tends to be fairly obvious because there's a narrow set of those that you really should always be heightening. And then other than that, everything else you should just pick new spells because you have a lot of spell selections other than the ones you're going to heighten. What if you're a buff plus debuff specialist with a side of heals? Now I would recommend your healing should be heightened a little slower. It shouldn't come out of your maximum rank spell slot, maybe your second or third max, because debuffs benefit a lot from this unlocked higher permission that I keep talking about. So you want to be picking debuffs that are natively in those higher rank spell slots. It'll let you punch way above your weight if you pick them out right. What if you're a damage and control specialist or a damage and debuff specialist? Again, damage is something you may choose to heighten. Single target damage, heighten Thunderstrike. Multi-target damage, it's kind of a conversation. Fireball heightens decently, not as good as Eclipse Burst, not as good as Chain Lightning, but it has a tangible advantage over both of those. It's less risky than Chain Lightning, but it's more ally-friendly than Eclipse Burst. You should be considering all three of them. There's no one right answer. Meanwhile, your control and debuff spells should almost always come out of your maximum rank spell slots because of the permission I keep talking about. When you reach level 9, your Wall of Stone is going to be way better than a heightened version of most control spells you have access to at this level. You should always be considering control and debuff spells from the slots they're natively in, but damage, it's a debate whether you heighten or pick a native slot. What if you're a debuff and control specialist? At that point, I would say you should focus almost entirely on spells that are natively in high rank slots because they just unlock that much more permission. It's the permission I keep talking about. And finally, an all-rounder might have some combination of all these considerations I listed, right? I hope this was a little bit helpful. Unfortunately, there is no one right answer. I guess the one sentence answer would be, you want to look at how much nonsense your new rank of spell slots is naturally allowed to do. If it's a lot, pick a natively high rank spell. If it's not a lot, heighten something from a lower rank. It might be more relevant. So the next step is, what do I do with my low rank spell slots? You can use the roles I mentioned before to figure out a lot of what you will do with your higher rank spell slots. You will fill it out with blasts, and then at higher levels, you will either start heightening those blasts or replace them with better blasts. But what do you do with those lower rank spell slots? Generally speaking, your best in combat 2 to 3 action spells come from your top 3 ranks of slots. There are exceptions to this. At higher levels of spellcasting play, especially at like levels 15 plus, you may end up with a significant chunk of your power budget coming from lower rank spell slots, but it's generally a good rule of thumb, especially for the first half of the game, that your top 3 ranks of slots are what's important. So what do you do with those other ranks, the ones that are below your top 3 ranks? A really common piece of advice is that you should fill them with evergreen spells, and I think that is terrible advice. The premise of this advice always seems to be damage needs to heighten to be good. Debuffs, for example, fear, don't need to heighten to be good, so it's evergreen. You should always have fear in your first rank once you're level 7 or higher and you can't put a damage spell in there. I think that's bad advice because fear is still worse than any of your higher rank spells. Like, is it really worth casting? Fear is directly worse than Agonizing Despair, is directly worse than Vision of Death. If you get to even higher ranks, Fear and Unspeakable Shadow is a laughable comparison which you shouldn't even be making. So is it really worth keeping a Fear in your lower rank slots? It's not going to compete with your higher rank slots, the same way as damage spells in that low rank slot doesn't compete with your higher rank damage spells. Now the next step in this discussion is always, oh, but what if you run out of your higher rank slots? And to that I say, I think you're letting a theoretical concern override your reason. Think about the average Pathfinder adventuring day. Let's say 5 combats. That's actually a really long adventuring day, by the way. And let's say it's 3 turns of combat for each of those 5 encounters. So that's 15 turns in the whole day. You're not going to want to cast a slotted spell on every single turn. A lot of spellcasters cast 1 to 2 slotted spells in a combat and then supplement that with focus spells and cantrips. You're not going to go fireball, 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 unless you're in a severe or extreme threat encounter where you might be encouraged to spend all of your spell slots. But then if you're in that kind of encounter, that's probably one of the only encounters you're having for the day, so you're not having 15 turns of combat. Conversely, if for some reason you're having like 20 turns of combat in the day, then it's not all moderate, severe, and extreme combat encounters. You could get away without ever spending a spell slot in low and trivial encounters. So no matter how you slice it, it's really hard to run out of your top 3 ranks of spell slots fully and then need to start considering first rank spells like Fear. Now you might say maybe there's that one adventuring day where you do have to do that. You should have scrolls for that adventuring day, and wands, and staves. Your low rank slots should not be containing these evergreen generically good spells that need you to spend 2 to 3 actions in combat, because those 2 to 3 actions are not going to be worth it over the other spell slots that you have. Now there's one exception, silver bullet spells. What's a silver bullet? A spell that's designed to address a really specific situation. If your enemy is the kind to restrain your friends by grabbing, you want Acid Grip around. You don't really have to worry about the rank of spell slot that Acid Grip is coming out of. Moving the enemy will be a really good effect. If the enemy has a dangerous reaction, you want Laughing Fit or Roaring Applause around, no matter how high level you get. So silver bullets do fit well into your low rank slots. They're going to be worth the 2 to 3 actions to cast, but do not stock your low rank slots with things like Fear just because online guides tell you to. Those guides are hyper focusing on the theoretical benefit of maybe using them on a really, really long adventuring day and forgetting how useless they will be in the majority of adventuring days when you will never cast them above a higher rank spell. So what do you actually do with them? I spent so much time ranting about what you don't do with them. Well, there's a lot of options. The first and perhaps most intuitive is to just convert them into out-of-combat utility. You can start looking at those spells that you dismissed when you were level 1, like Ant Haul, Air Bubble, Carry All, Water Breathing, Water Walking, Gecko Grip. All of these spells can now be used to solve out-of-combat situations, and that's great. That gives you a lot of utility. That gives you a lot of breadth to bring into campaigns that goes beyond combat. Because again, between your top 3 ranks of slots, your focus spells, your cantrips, and your staff, your wands, and your scrolls, you have combat covered. So having out of combat covered by these is great. Another thing to do is long duration pre-buffs. And now we're starting to look at ways where these low rank spells can impact combat without taking your actions in combat. Remember, the problem with those evergreen spells like Fear was that it takes 2 actions in the middle of combat, and those 2 actions are better spent on the higher rank spell slot. But if you cast False Vitality, now you have boosted your defenses without worrying about casting those 2 actions in combat, because that lasts a long time. If you cast Carry All at 4th rank, you can now give yourself an easy way to fly via the sustain action without having to worry about casting anything in combat. If you cast a 2nd rank Tailwind, you'll probably get a GM to ban it. If you cast Elemental Sense, you'll be really good at dealing with hidden enemies or invisible enemies without worrying too much about it. So long duration pre-buffs are a great way to take your lower rank spell slots and convert them into in-combat value. Another thing you can do is look at reaction options. Why reaction specifically? If the problem with evergreen spells was them costing 2 actions, reactions are cheap. And the other thing is, spellcasters often don't have a weaponized reaction like martials do, so finding a way to use that is great. If you want to focus on offense, you can use reactions like Brine Dragon's Bile or Blood Spray Curse. You can focus on defense with Interposing Earth, Hidebound, Wooden Double, Zephyr Slip. And then you could focus on utility with options like Lose the Path or Propulsive Breeze. Every spell list has at least a couple good reactions to be considering, and when they come out of a slot that's really cheap, their value is not that important. You might look at Lose the Path when you're at level 1 and say, I have to rely on anybody to fail their save, I'm not going to do it. But when you're level 9, that Lose the Path is so cheap that it's worth doing. And finally, one action options or flexible action options. Things like Timely Tutor can help you get a boost for a Recall Knowledge check. A one action Magic Missile can get some poke damage in between your 2 action spells. A one action Time Jump can help you get out of a sticky situation. So one action options are a little less good than reaction options, but still worth considering. So these are all the ways I would say you can use your low rank spell slots, and they will help you not fall into the trap of those evergreen spells like Fear, because you really shouldn't be casting them out of your 1st rank spell when you're level 9 or higher. Now the last thing I want to cover in terms of spell selection is your 3rd action. A spellcaster's turn is often 2+1. 2 is your main spell. Most spells are 2 actions, and then what you do with the 3rd action can define the difference between an okay and a good spellcaster. You should always be thinking about how you're going to weave that 3rd action into your turns. Recall Knowledge and Demoralize are 2 really easy things to be doing. They give you ways of impacting the enemy's saving throw that they're about to make, and then you use a 2 action spell that's going to be really impactful. But they're not the only options you have. Another option is 1 action spells, especially from lower rank spell slots like I talked about earlier. A Force Barrage can give you some nice ping damage. A Sure Strike can improve your upcoming attack roll. A Timely Tutor might be able to give you more Recall Knowledge than you would have gotten with your own action. And then these 1 action spells now combo into your remaining 2 actions in some or the other meaningful way. The next thing to consider is 1 action cantrips. A shield or a glass shield can defend you, and a guidance can buff either your attack roll or a friend's attack roll pretty cheaply. The next thing is class and archetype specific options. Maybe you have a 1 action class cantrip like Courageous Anthem or Clinging Ice. Maybe you have a 1 action focus spell like Ancestral Memories or Elemental Toss. And finally, maybe you have an animal companion or something of the sort that you can command and get better action economy benefits out of. The next thing to consider is 3 action spells and sustain actions. So a 3 action spell is kind of like just bolting a 3rd action onto your 2 action spell. Not much to be said there. Just use a 3 action spell if you think it's good. Sustain is the interesting one. Floating Flame, Cinder Swarm, Freezing Rain. All of these are spells where their upfront cost doesn't seem to be worth the actions, but once you start sustaining them and interweaving them with 2 action spells, it feels really good. I would really recommend thinking about sustain on classes that don't have good focus spells or focus cantrip, like say the Wizard, but have a lot of spell slots, because just throw a spell out and sustain it, right? That's a good way to have a 3rd action. And finally, if you can truly think of nothing else for your character, carry a bow. Take a general feat to carry a longbow or a short bow, and if you can't even afford that, just carry a crossbow that you'll fire once per combat. It's okay to just have a weapon that you'll sometimes use on your 3rd action. Anything you could do with your +1 action will make your spellcaster feel really good. And now you want to look at all of these things you do with your third action and see how they weave in with your spells. If you're picking Recall Knowledge as your go-to third action, maybe be an Arcane spellcaster who can bring a variety of saves to get maximal value out of it. If you're carrying a bow, make sure a lot of your spells don't have the multiple attack penalties so you can combo it with them. If you're going to be sustaining it a lot, pick good sustained spells, and so on and so forth. So we have talked a lot about all these mechanical things that can impact your spell selection, but we haven't talked about what is many people's most important factor, thematics. There's this common opinion that thematic casters are going to be punished within the system, that all this expectation of variety and versatility and being able to get this permission of spells and whatnot can overbearingly restrict your themes. And I get where the opinions are coming from. I really do. I can see why people think so. But ultimately, I have to disagree. I have seen and played many spellcasters that are really thematically cohesive in this game. And yeah, you could build them. You could start with the theme and then end with a caster. You don't have to start with a caster and then build a theme around them. The first step is just seeing if your theme might naturally fill out the fundamentals I listed earlier. Many themes, I would say the majority of them even, will naturally do so. For example, I want to build a druid who is an elementalist. You can very easily be an elementalist who targets 2 saves and AC and has multiple traits of damage so that you don't really have to worry about immunities that much either. Elementalist is already a cohesive theme. Likewise, you may say, I want to be a mentalist, and initially you may think, oh, I'm gonna run into mental immunity because that's somewhat common, right? But there's a lot of mental options that don't interact with the enemy, they just interact with your friends. So maybe you will play something like a bard or a silent whisper psychic, because this caster can now use mental options to buff their friends and ignore enemies in case they happen to be mental immune. And when they're not mental immune, you're just a full-on mentalist. Most themes can be represented if you just follow all the fundamentals I mentioned. Now, there is a minority of themes where something might be so narrow that you're not able to fill out the fundamentals listed. If you want to be a single element elementalist, you probably can't even target 2 saves in AC depending on the exact element you're going for, and you definitely don't have multiple traits of damage. At that point, I would recommend being a little flexible with the thematics of the spells you're picking so that you can import some of that expected variety. For example, if you're going for a cold theme, perhaps you may pick Revealing Light as being a snow blindness option. You reflected light off of snow onto your enemy's eyes and now they're dazzled. You might pick Slow as being something like encrusting the enemy in frost, perhaps channeling the might of a glacier if you're, say, more of a druid than a sorcerer. All of these can work really well. You just have to be a little bit flexible with the thematics, and then you can incorporate spells that don't naturally have the trait. I'm not saying you need to pick fire spells that a cold mage should do well. You just need to pick adjacent spells. Likewise, if you have a fire theme, you might perhaps pick Heal and say, I am channeling the healing magic of a phoenix. Or you might pick buff spells and say, the fire within me stokes the fervor within my friends' hearts. All of these are valid ways of showcasing a fire theme. You're not deviating from the theme. I'm not telling you to pick water spells, but now you have the variety the game expects of you. And finally, there just are going to be certain character concepts that are unfortunately not represented well within the system. Every system has those. For example, until the Necromancer fully comes out, one could argue that it's really hard to build a mass summoner of any kind in the system. In such cases, I would say pick a broader theme, and it's unfortunate. I hope Paizo looks into classes to fill this theme for you later. However, I would say something like 95% of the thematics you would expect of a caster can fall in the first 2 points. And now that second point, that being flexible with spells, that brings a lot of people to this blind spot. I don't want to reflavor. That is an understandable reaction. It feels nice to have your fantasy be supported by the game itself, right? By the game's inherent mechanics. Unfortunately, this reflavoring becomes mandatory as a consequence of the spell bloat I mentioned earlier. Pathfinder has way too many spells. It has 1,000 spells. There's going to be way more. Now let's take a simple example. Let's look at Fly. If you came to me and said, I want to make a fire mage, but I want my flight to come from burning jets like Azula, I would say pick Fly and flavor it as such. If you want to be a mentalist who concentrates on flying, mind over mattering their way into flight, I would say pick fly and reflavor that. It can be an unsatisfactory answer because there is this ideal world in which your flavor has a mechanical consequence, right? Maybe your Azula style flight lets you move further than anyone else's flight, but doesn't let you hover for too long. Maybe the mentalist style flight lets you cover vertical distances without difficult terrain, but you have to sustain it every round. These would all be really cool. But now imagine a world where every spell that has generic flavor, like fly, heal, etc., has 6 or 7 different variations for each of the possible variations people want. That would get overwhelming fast. That would mean today's 1,000 spells looks like 6 or 7,000 spells. Would you really want to be looking at 6 or 7,000 spells when making your decisions? It would make the other problems worse to try to fix this problem. Now, perhaps in a future edition of Pathfinder, a lot of magic users are more like the kineticists, where you can express a lot of narrow themes in bespoke ways. That's not the version of Pathfinder we have. The version of Pathfinder we have, you should pick spells. And if you're going to be picking spells, it's a good idea to reflavor. This is also not an entirely out-of-universe argument. Reflavoring actually has in-universe support too. So there is a chapter of Secrets of Magic that is described entirely from the perspective of in-universe magic users. This is what the occultist has to say about magic. They say that occult magic is not really just this box of unfathomable power. It is the metaphysical reality formed by ideas, art, and expression. Every time somebody thinks, every time somebody learns a lesson, every time somebody laughs or cries, they contribute to the collective subconscious that forms occult magic. When an occult spellcaster is using this magic, it isn't really looking like I cast this exact spell to get this exact effect by moving my hands this exact times. Bards are improvisationally singing. Perhaps they're making the other person think about a better time, which soothes their emotions and makes them heal. Perhaps you're revealing an internal shame and making them feel fear and making them feel slow. When you cast slow from a bard, it's not the same as a slow from a psychic who might be doing something else. Maybe they're actually metaphysically holding the other person in place. It's not the same as when a wizard casts it, which I'll get into later. All of these are in-universe described as being different. The same is true for primal spellcasters. There is a letter from a druid explaining to her grandchild what spellcasting works like when you're a primal mage. And they talk about how you can sometimes use the exact same components of spells, for example, a leaf, to invoke entirely different magic. The leaf can invoke wind magic because one druid thinks of the leaf fluttering in the wind, but another thinks of the leaf as nourishing the soil and it invokes healing magic. You might get the exact same effect in different ways. For a fire spell, you might think about praying to the southern cardinal direction, but you might also think about lighting a candle, and you might also think about a lightning striking a forest, and all of these are valid ways of casting fire magic. Then there was a perspective from a cleric where they simply said that it is foolish to even try to claim that you understand and can quantify divine magic, like a wizard claims they can quantify arcane magic. And finally, you might think, well, wizards quantify their magic. But no, they don't. In universe, there's multiple understandings of the exact same magic. Even among wizards who are meant to categorize and understand magic, there's a lot of differences in how they seem to categorize and understand magic. In the excerpt from the wizard, they explicitly say that when spells are characterized, they like to think of the manifestation rather than what you did or who did it or how you did it, because it's just more useful as a form of instruction. So even wizards in universe say that no, spells are not just discrete things. A fireball is not a fireball is not a fireball. Fireball is the name given to the manifestation of fire appearing in universe, but different casters get it in different ways. And if different casters get it in different ways, then you should be feeling free to reflavor your slow into being an ice mage's power, or your heal into being a fire mage's power. All of it works. All of it works both in universe and out of universe in a satisfactory way, in my opinion. And of course, we reflavor martials all the time. So if someone tells you they want to be lightly armored or unarmored even, A lot of the time you might tell them, why don't you just draw or flavor your character as being unarmored, but mechanically just still have an armor. We do this on martials all the time. We should do it for spellcasters too. It will make your experience better. And of course, your cold mage does not need to start picking fire spells to be viable. Your cold mage just needs to pick revealing light, fear, slow, some combination of those things to feel viable. You don't need to go completely against your theme. You just need to come up with a good reason for why you have a certain spell count as in theme for you. And reading Secrets of Magic has given me a lot of inspiration on that, like all that leaf analogy and the collective subconscious stuff, so I hope it does for you too. And of course, in the worst case, the game does seem to be getting more narrowly themed spellcasters. There's the Necromancer, the Psychic, the Runesmith, the Summoner, the Kineticist. They do cover a lot of fantasies that can be hard to fit without reflavoring on other spellcasters. So play one of those and wait for the time that Paizo releases something that fills your fantasy for you. That'll be all for today's video, folks. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it helpful for selecting spells in your own spellcasters. And I hope that last bit about the reflavoring is going to help at least some players make characters that they previously thought were impossible, because I really think reflavoring is the way to go for building a really narrowly themed spellcaster. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you really like this video, please consider joining as a channel membership. It's a really quick and easy way to support me directly for a pretty low cost. If you have anything you disagree with, feel free to comment and let me know. I'm always happy to engage in the comment section and discuss and perhaps come to a consensus. That'll be all for today. See you later.